Right. Hello, folks. Welcome to another, however you pronounce it, episode of Let's Talk Common Sense with me, Mike Obani. It's been a very interesting period. I was just telling our guest, I've been away for a week, resting, going to the park to play basketball. I went to a park where students were, and I didn't know there was a festival going on. I just went to play basketball. But what I saw when I got there was a ridiculous amount of students having a festival. Some were swimming in the pond. I mean, it was like you let people out who had been in prison for years, and they were having a whale of a time. And I think if we go back to a fourth lockdown, people hate when I say this. I think students will have to have a good lump of the blame. But anyways, that's what I've been up to. Whilst I was away, I don't know, kind of race war started. I don't know what you want to call it, but we had this new report by this independent commission, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Fronted by Dr. Tony Sewell, CBE, and I should say that because that's important, the CBE part. And this is a report that was commissioned essentially after Black Lives Matter happened to try and figure out what's going to be the structural changes needed in the UK. And shocker, folks, what came back was we don't need to do anything, actually, because there is no institutional racism. Now, of course, they did put forward 24 recommendations thereabouts. But what they said and what the headline is that the UK isn't institutionally racist, and we're actually a role model for the entire world. So I thought, wow, how interesting. Obviously, I had a read through. We've since covered it on Common Sense. So if you go on tcsnetwork.co.uk, you can see a breakdown of some of the key findings. We've done some stories where we share with you, the people who are part of the report. But I just messaged Femi straight away because I said, I just need your thoughts on this, because honestly, I have so many thoughts. I don't even know where to begin. So joining me today is political commentator. You've seen him everywhere. He needs an introduction, really. He's been on the podcast before. Femi Sorry. I'm so sorry to pull you out after this ridiculous report. I saw David Lammy tweeting that he just needs to take a break for his mental health because it's just gaslighting on steroids. Let's just jump straight in. Like, what do you think? What do you think?
So this is what happens when you have a government that is led by somebody who once said that the problem in Africa is not that we were once in charge, but that we're not in charge anymore, accused Barack Obama of having a part Kenyan's ancestral dislike of the British Empire, and in response to the Black Lives Matter protests said that his aim is to change the narrative. This should be stop the sense of victimization. So basically saying, I'm sorry you all feel like victims. We're going to try and talk you out of it. And then he appointed somebody who was black, who he knew didn't really believe in systemic racism, because that's pretty much all the black people that they've got, be it Munir Misra, be it Kemi Badenoch, be it Tony Sewell, everybody who's been involved in this process doesn't believe systemic racism, and is on record as saying they don't believe systemic racism exists. So they've appointed those black faces specifically, even though they are clearly the minority opinion among black people in the UK, to produce a report which says that systemic racism isn't that big of a problem. And the way they've done it can be best shown in what they say about employment. So the report does acknowledge that systemic racism that there's discrimination in the workplace when it comes to hiring, and it refers to various studies that have been done, such as where they send out identical CVs to many different employers, and they change only the name, and they change the name so that some of you send people with black sounding, African sounding names, Asian sounding names, Middle Eastern sounding names, and you then see how many get callbacks. And they found that people with African sounding names have to send roughly, well, according to this report, 60%, and other reports, 80% more job applications to get a call back, and slightly more for Middle Eastern. So that proves that there's discrimination against names that don't sound British. But the conclusions that it drew were that you can't really rely on this because it might be due to the perceived class or foreign culture of the people with those names. I'm sorry. if your assumption when you see a black name is to assume they're of a class that's too low to employ them,
that's literally
racism.
that's literally racism.
But to classify that as some sort of get out of jail card, like, oh, we're not racist, we're just racist and classist, therefore we're not racist, is a bit of a weird argument to make.
You know, I struggled with the report because honestly, I mean, many people have made the joke, but I really thought it was like a April Fool's thing, because I mean, it's at a kilter with everything else that's been written about race and the broad consensus for the past decade or so. I mean, yep. David Cameron, of all people, you know, Theresa May, they conceded that, hey, there's a problem here. And here's the part that's really disappointing for me is it seems as though, and with Boris Johnson, you never know whether he's interested in political expediency or if he actually has some sort of moral compass, because he kind of distanced himself in some way from the report. He said, hey, no, we're not gonna take everything in it. We're gonna see it, whatever. So how awkward when even the prime minister reads this and goes, I'm not sure about this one. But you've got the doctor, the good doctor, and by the way, I think it's an honorary doctorate, which annoys me even more. But you've got the good doctor who's traveling, going all over, going across the media circuit, kind of putting his full weight behind this thing as some sort of, you know, data-driven, academic, independent. I mean, he's not even independent. So I find it odd that they call them, it's meant to be an independent. I get it, independent from the government, yes. But the folks, I mean, this is the same guy who 3 years ago was at the Oxford Union arguing for the fact that the UK's education is racist. So he's got this long history of saying it doesn't exist, and you now give him the job to go find it. Is it shocking when he comes back and goes, doesn't exist? I mean, the whole thing is just kind of flawed.
This was their intention going into it. I mean, they went into this saying, we don't believe the racism exists, or that systemic racism exists. Therefore, we're going to hire people who don't believe it exists to then come back and tell us they don't believe it exists. And as you said, they try and play it off as data-driven, but the ideology is dripping from it. Because even when they do present data, which, as I said, shows the racism exists, they still manage to use their ideology to come to the exact opposite conclusion. And one of the things that was the most that you've got to be joking, you must be joking, parts of the report was on education. And on that, they said that we need to basically scrap this idea of decolonizing the curriculum, i.e., always stopping the situation where everything is told from the British perspective, nothing is told from the perspective of other countries, and we don't really talk about the impact and the damage that was done by the British Empire. We're going to stop that effort, and because we don't need to be using, I think the phrase they used was token black achievements will not brighten the minds of brighten young minds.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah.
And then they said that instead they want people to, they want young kids to reclaim their sense of British heritage, and that we need to learn that slavery wasn't just about profit and suffering, but it also helped Black Africans to culturally remodel themselves into Black British, into African British, helped them to culturally remodel themselves. That, I mean, there's British understatement, and then there's painting slavery as some sort of character building foreign exchange. You what?
I read that. Honestly, there's just so much in there that just makes me go, what was the intention? And I guess a part of me, what feels really sad, and we should talk about this because I want to go into the report and help, because there might be people out there who are actually like, what is institutional racism? How do we seek change? We'll come to that. Let me just vent for a minute because another thing that really kind of confused me. And what was an insult to the injury was these are apparently Black and ethnic minority leaders in the community who wrote this report. Right, they're the ones who were picked, right, to be the ones who fronted this report. You know, Dr. Tony, who you're speaking about, has done amazing work with Generating Genius, a charity I'm very familiar with. You know, there was another woman, I forgot her name. She is a well-known kind of science, kind of engineering producer and broadcaster. I forgot her name; it escapes me. But again, we've got the names of all the people involved on TCS.UK. You've got all these people who, for so long, have been doing a lot in the community. How is it so that they should come out with this? Or that's it, Maggie Adarin Polkuk. Again, another MBE. How is it that these folks who have been in this country for so long, who've seen all these issues we're talking about, how is it that they should come out with this conclusion and go, you know, this is what it is, when you've got 5 reports prior about race in this country that concluded pretty much the opposite thing? They concluded that something's wrong, but in this one report, which is I think David Lammy's report was 2019, I believe, or maybe it was just in 2 years or 3 years, we've become the role model for the world. You kind of go, how is this possible? How is it Black people, for the most part, they've come up with this stuff?
Well, I think it's important to avoid this. There will always be groups that vote against interest, regardless of what position they're in. I mean, I have a family, not family. I know some people who are Black, who are related to me, who actually voted UKIP. So they're voting against interest does exist. And if you've got a Home Secretary who is on record as saying that her own immigration policy would have prevented her family from entering the country, you can't use you can no longer use brown faces to say, well, no, it can't be bad for Black and brown faced people because clearly this person's willing to support it. They handpick these people. It's the phenomenon that I often refer to as Kanye syndrome, of being rich enough that you can essentially avoid the adversity that racism causes, therefore no longer feeling inherently that you need to protect that interest.
I think the fact that folks even try to pass it off as intellectual speaks to another layer of privilege that, quite frankly, the majority of Black people in the UK don't have access to. When I told my mum about this report, we had a long chat yesterday. She just scoffed and said, she said, this country is not ready for, because she doesn't have that privilege of just to be able to say, I can just ascend over and treat racism as this intellectual thing and go, well, let's take a look at institutional racism and let's see if the data bear witness to that. It's like they don't have that experience. It's a, and what I loathed, if to be quite frank, because I've been watching some coverage on it, was Black right-wing kind of commentators going on these different shows and mocking lived experiences. They're like, oh, I'm about to say it again, lived experience. And I'm like, no, it's a thing. it's not a quotation marks thing.
Yeah.
And it just saddens me that when things like this happen, there's always a group of Black commentators that are ready to go out on media outlets. And for some reason, this is the battle they choose to fight. The one that says that lived experiences don't matter, we can't prove institutional racism, and the data doesn't bear witness to how people feel. And for that reason, people are delusional for what they experience on a day-to-day basis.
So it's important to remember how the media works. The people that invite you onto shows, they've already decided what they want their debates to look like. Yeah. And so you're more likely to get on if you have that viewpoint that they want to promote. And in fact, some of the most viral and famous clips that I've been in are where essentially I've clearly shown I've refused to go down their narrative. And a key example would be when they brought me on to discuss This Morning brought me on to discuss Rule Britannia, And they wanted me to promote the idea that Black Lives Matter was about getting rid of rule Britannia. And because I refused to accept that narrative and said it wasn't about that, it was about ending systemic racism, that's what created a huge conflict. And the actual host was furious at me for trying to actually correct the narrative. So I understand why these people get on, because there's only one door you're allowed to go through, and they say, well, if I'm going to get on media, that's the door I need to walk through. And so they just don't care enough to have the integrity not to do it.
It's a shame. I've said the same thing often, that what you often see is people play into the gallery, saying incendiary things, growing a public following, and then just pivoting later on and being a bit more measured and nuanced. But what they don't realize is in the process of doing that, they cause so much damage. It is just not worth it. 50,000 followers is not worth the kind of self-hatred, quite frankly, that some people go through because of your appearances on these shows. Like, it's just not worth it. And I think with a report like this, honestly, I'm filled with sadness more than anything. I'm not even, like I said about David Lammy, I felt exactly how it felt, which is just, this cannot be serious. This cannot be serious. You've got a government internally saying that they're going on this war on wokeness. And what that means is, anything you put out, any report you put out is tainted because you've already admitted to your veneer. You've already said that this is the worldview I have. And so you put an independent behind the report doesn't make it independent, because we know already what you want to find. And if you're looking for something you want to find, you're going to find it when you have a thumping majority, when you're enjoying record-breaking, approval ratings, and when, unfortunately, you've got an absent opposition.
Yeah.
What did you think about Keir Starmer's response to this report?
He needs to be louder. He needs to be saying, I mean, it's not just the fact that his response to this report wasn't strong enough. It's that he should have been on this consistently, especially since last summer, and he hasn't. Because we should have heard every single week, you're doing a report into the existence of racism, but your own government website shows that Black people are stopped and searched by your own police 10 times more than white people. So you have this information. What are you doing to change it now? What laws are you passing to make sure that, for example, there was the boy Hugo Boateng, the 13-year-old who was on a cycle ride with his father, and the instruction given to police was look for an IC3 on a bike, which means look for a black male on a bike. That's the police description. That's all they were given. Black male on a bike. Now, you would never have an APB go out for white male on a bike. That just would not happen. And as a result, this 13-year-old boy was chased down by by plainclothes police officers, scraped his face up trying to get through a bush, and was nearly tasered. They aimed tasers at him. That shouldn't happen. You can put measures in place to make sure there is never a description that vague, but they did nothing. And so Keir Starmer should have been calling this out on a regular basis, and he hasn't. And I understand his general quietness during the pandemic, because you want to avoid a situation where you look like you're trying to score political points when we all need to be pulling together to make sure we beat this disease. But on issues like this, where you know that you're dealing with a prime minister who has a track record of being on the wrong side, he should have been louder.
Yeah, absolutely. They call him a statesman and balanced and nuanced. That's not what we need right now. And I'm going to say something that I really don't often say, because I'm one of those nostalgic people that talks about back in the days and we had conviction politicians and blah, 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 and everything now is media based. But unfortunately for Sir Keir, he doesn't get the media game. He doesn't get the media age we're in. And it's a shame to watch him and Johnson go at it, because you've got someone who's formidable when it comes to the media game and media spin. I mean, someone told me something yesterday that I wouldn't put it past Boris Johnson, which was that he commissioned this report. It came out saying these things. He's seen how it's been received, and now he's distancing himself from it to further elevate, how maybe people think about him. I wouldn't put that past him. Not saying that's what happened, but that's how cunning, to be quite frank, I think he is. Whereas Sakir comes out again wet as a flannel. I'm a bit disappointed with the report, and you're like, well, that's just not good enough. Unfortunately, it's not what we need right now. But hey, let's try to turn a page and be positive. And let me ask you some questions, especially about kind of racism and institutional racism, because some of the arguments that people make is, well, if we're going to fix something, we have to be able to define it. We have to be able to kind of spot it, point at it, blah, 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 blah. So for folks who are still thinking, what is institutional racism? I mean, what would you say to them if they go, what is it?
Institutional racism. So I guess the technical definition is a systemic practice within institutions that results in disproportionate outcomes against people from ethnic minorities. So if you were to look at the fact that Black people are stopped and searched by police 10 times more than white people, if you look at the fact that you can have a description go out where you can just be looking for black male on a bike, that is a failure of the system within that institution, and it allows these disparities to come about. So that's an example. You could, whether or not, when it comes to employment, you could refer to the fact that if you've got a Nigerian sounding name, you have to send 80% more job applications to get a call offer. That was done by Oxford University, which used 3,200 identical CVs, sending them out to different parts of the economy, and they came back. They changed only the name, proved that disparity exists. So that's the difference between systemic and institutional racism. Is I'm not an expert on that particular distinction, but that's the idea. Basically, a system which creates an advantage, relative advantage. Of course, people who are white obviously suffer poverty just as everybody else does, but it creates an advantage over anybody with an ethnic background that is minority.
One thing the report said, thank you for that. I think that's going to help a lot of people kind of clarify that. One thing the report said is, well, the stop and search records may be down to, I mean, one could argue that it's over policing, blah, 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 blah. But then some have said, oh, it's because there's actually more criminality in those communities. And that's why they're stopped and searched more. What would you say to that?
So the answer to that is to look at the question. I'm really blunt when I get when this gets put to me. I say, well, how many middle class Black people do you see carrying knives? We are aware of the line between poverty and criminality, lack of options and criminality. That is very, very clear. Now, if you have more poverty within a certain group, if a certain group finds it 80% harder to escape poverty because of the systemic racism that's placed on them. For example, if you know that you, with your name that is an African background, it will have to send 80% more job applications to get a call back. That creates a heightened. That means that Black people are essentially more trapped in poverty than white people. So to use the systemic racism that traps Black people in poverty in the situations where people have fewer options as a reason to be racist against them is seriously problematic.
Big time. I mean, it's that distinction. And again, I saw another right-wing commentator talking about this, because the point he was trying to make was, and it's one of those things that I think they call it a distinction without difference. When folks go, well, a lot of people are feeling personal racism and they're confusing it for a systemic kind of thing. And I go, well, the question is, how do we solve it, brother? Right? That's the question. So do we go around one by one to each kind of person, trying to understand the kind of, the kind of idiosyncrasies of their kind of expression of their experience? Or do we kind of lump them together and go, okay, cool, well let's look at the system, right? Yeah. And work out how we can maybe, with one fell swoop, ensure that they don't experience what they're all experiencing individually. Because at some stage, you have to ask yourself, how do we actually solve things?
So the answer to, well, not the answer. The biggest answer for me is blind CVs. It should be the norm that we ban the inclusion of names, gender, sex, and primary and high school from all CVs, because those are serious factors of discrimination. Where you were born, what region of the country you're from, your sex and gender, the ethnicity of your name. Take those out. As I just said, there are serious disparities in terms of how likely you are to get a callback based on your name alone. Take those out, we get a much fairer country, and it has a double effect. It won't just mean that you will get Black people more into those roles more, but it will mean that people will have more experience of seeing Black people and Asian people in those higher roles, and therefore the perception of Black and Asian people will be elevated as a result of that. So it has a double effect. That is, for me, that's the biggest thing that needs to happen to address systemic racism in the UK.
Absolutely. I agree with that. Someone asked me a question, though, which I'm going to pose to you now, which I guess is a pushback on that, which is that, well, suppose you have someone who's racist and who sees a name and, Toluwa Olusegun, and they go, no, not interested. I'm looking for, John Fraser. And then we have blind CVs, which means they employ Toluwa Olusegun. Well, that means they employ him not by their own will, right? But because essentially he's good at the job. But when they see Toluwa Olusegun turn up at work, then they create an environment that they go, that's just not conducive for him to succeed. And so when he gets that job, he's essentially somewhere where he isn't wanted. And so the argument was that, well, yes, it may achieve what you're speaking about in terms of visibility and all these kind of other things. And for some employers, they ultimately care, quite frankly, about their bottom line. So the most interesting thing for them is that you have someone who can do the job. But for folks who are genuinely racist, doesn't it just mean that, it's just delayed, if you like, the racism that the person applying for the job will essentially feel?
So in law, there's the phrase necessary but not sufficient. Blind CVs are necessary to address systemic racism, but they won't go the whole way, and they won't solve it completely. So yes, you can have the argument that, okay, but they've got through the application stage, but when they turn up at interview, they might be racist against them. Yes, they got through the interview stage, but when they're in the job, they might be racist against them. We can improve the laws to prevent workplace discrimination. B, the out and out racists, you have to basically work on society. And again, because of that double effect, because of that increased visibility of people from ethnic minorities in those higher roles, you will generally significantly attack racism itself, because the perception of Black and brown people will improve as a result. So it is a slow process. If the government changed it tomorrow, it would make a significant difference, but it would not go the full way. We still need time to fix that. Yeah,
and that's my thing, Femi. That's where my chair is perched, whatever the term is. I don't know. That's where I've put my chair. Cause I'm just wondering. So the societal change is what I look at and go, can this country beats its chest relentlessly about how tolerant it is. I genuinely think, as a culture, this country thinks it's smashed it. They're like, we've done it. we're done.
Racial equality, completed it, mate. Completed it, mate.
Like, smashed it. So the problem is this country as a whole. Do you see them? And I say them because I don't like us versus them narratives. I'm using it here to make the point. Is, do you see movement happening? And people up and down the country, in Devon, in Buckinghamshire, in Epsom, in all these different places where, let's be frank, black people tend not to go. Do you see movement still happening there? Anti-racism, people unlearning, all the kind of years of whatever they learn, or are we still living in this country, unfortunately, facilitated by Black people themselves, where their conclusion is there's nothing left to do. There's some little bits and bobs we need to trim, but there's no big systemic or institutional change that needs to happen. When you hear that, how hopeful are you to have a country where people actually are still unlearning and willing to do the work. And not just people in metropolitan cities like London that's already 40% non-white, but literally majority white places of this country. When I put my chair out, I'll be honest in saying, I don't know how, where the appetite or what the willingness is for the majority of the country, the 90% of the country, to go, we've got to change. We've got to do stuff to contort ourselves to make lives more equal for people who don't look like us.
Unfortunately, we're trapped in a vicious circle because we have this narrative from the government, facilitated by the media, that racism is a problem that's behind us, that we're almost a post-racial society. And the reason why that's allowed to happen is because, and this is really important, even though the majority of this country votes progressive, so Labour, the Lib Dems, the SNP, and the Greens got a majority of the vote in the 2019 election, 2019 European election, the 2017 general election. We have a country that votes progressive, but the system, the first past the post voting system, keeps allowing the Tories to take absolute power. As a result, every reports, every commission study that's done, every message from Downing Street will be telling people the job's done. We've dealt with racism, even though the majority of this country does recognize the problem and does think we need to move more towards the left, more towards a tolerant society, and that there's still work to do. But because we keep seeing that narrative from the top telling us everything's fine, progress is stifled.
You've summed it up. You have a way of summing these things up, because I do think that's where we're at. And, as we end this short episode, honestly, I don't know. David Lammy keeps coming back to mind, because that's kind of where I'm at. A part of me just wants to put my head under the pillow and just go, you know what? Yeah. Yeah. Do you think? Because it's like you're fighting two fights, isn't it? You've got one systemic struggle and all these kind of stuff we're doing. A lot of people working behind the scenes, doing different campaigns, media, all these kind of things. And then you have a report that, quite frankly, sets us back. It's like going back, because I've seen the commentary, people going, see, all that Black Lives Matter stuff, you guys are basically taking America's issue and you're bringing it to the UK. And that's now becoming a dominant narrative, that we're treating the UK like America.
So it's important for me to be upfront about this. 11 out of my 14 years of school were in private schools, surrounded by almost exclusively white people. I was always the black kid. So my experience of it would be very easy for me to grow up and be a Kemi Badenoch who hasn't had enough experiences of racism or even a black perspective to really talk about this issue and then become part of the problem. So that is something that is very easy to that is a road that's very easy to go down. And if you haven't seen racism in your life, you're going to find it very easy to downplay it. And the strategy of the modern day racist in the media isn't to say overtly racist things, isn't necessarily even to say dog whistly racist things. It's to say that racism doesn't exist, because that by doing that, by downplaying this, you will reduce the sense of urgency to fix things, and you will help protect the racist structures that exist. That is their aim.
And on that bombshell, I don't want to. I mean, what do I say to everyone who's involved in the fight? Keep going. It's okay to take time out.
Just to be really clear on how we get out of this, those changes need to happen, but for that to happen, we need a new government. Now, in order to get a new government, as I said, the majority votes progressive. We voted Labour, the Lib Dems, the SNP, and the Greens got over half the vote in the last election, but you still ended up with the Tories having 56% of the parliament, giving them absolute power. Nobody else's votes count. How do you fix that? That requires the progressive votes to be united. How do you do that? If Labour commits to changing our voting system to proportional representation, whereby every vote counts equally within 12 months of taking office, then that means that Lib Dem and Green voters will know that if they vote for Labour in this next election, all future votes for their parties will actually count, which they really don't now, which means you can have that electoral pact between the various parties, meaning that every single one of the votes in this country that votes progressive, which is the majority, will count. Boris Johnson will be removed from power. We'll have a progressive country. We'll start to be able to put in place the changes that we need to achieve equality in the UK. That is what needs to happen. So we need to pressure your local Labour constituency to make sure they commit to that. Then we can make progress.
I mean, I totally hear you. Of course, we can open up another tab on voting systems, because what you're talking about also will mean we might see a third party emerge. That's Brexit Party, that's UKIP, that's the coalition of all those different votes as well. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because that is democracy, right? But that's one of the things that we have to also consider, is there is a growing movement, especially since the fallout of Brexit and further on, of these folks who are politically homeless, who feel like their country is being quote unquote taken from them, and you know, PR would be the best proportional representation, or AV, whatever you call it, would be a great voting system, because it would allow them to coalesce all their support and essentially mount this kind of cultural war thing we're seeing right now, where honestly, on any topic, when I look at Good Morning Britain, or I look at, This Morning, whatever it is, I just know that there'll be someone who's like, yeah, whatever. There'll be someone who goes, our country's been lost. We need to go back, woke, anti-woke. Like, and it's so saddening to see that. I mean, someone tweeted out, this for me was the high point, when during the whole Meghan Markle interview thing, everyone's talking about racism, whatever. Someone tweets out, oh, this is the left, and I was like, left? This is just a woman talking about her experience in what, but somehow folks spin it into the left wing, right wing veneer. Continuum. And that's what I'm seeing happening, is that we're seeing. So when you say PR, a part of me is also a bit kind of like, my heart gets jostled a bit, because I go, do we really want that?
So a couple of points on the issue of what if the right coalesces behind one party. They already do. In this last election in 2019, the Brexit Party stood down candidates to make sure everybody could vote Conservative. There's effectively one party on the right. There is several on the left, which means the left is always going to be split. And in a system where you don't get an MP unless you come first, the right's always got to have that advantage, because there's only one of them. And as for the issue of what if under PR, UKIP, for example, which only gets like 4% or so, doesn't have enough votes under PR, but it is under first past the post, but it will have enough vote to get some MPs under PR. Good. To be honest, if 4% of the UK wants to vote for UKIP, then we can't use a democratically unfair system to hide that fact. Not to mention, those narratives need to be challenged publicly. Get a couple of UKIP MPs in Parliament, get them to try and defend their views on a public stage rather than just in back alley Facebook groups, and then you'll start to see some of these narratives properly challenged. And as for the culture war, that culture war is going to keep raging. But that culture war we will lose if the left is constantly fighting each other. Now, the system of first past the post means if you're in a constituency and you've got several parties on the left, or several, then you have to make sure that you destroy all of your competition. It's a much more adversarial system, because if you don't defeat everybody, you don't get a voice at all. Whereas if you're talking about PR, that system means that votes, essentially, that the parties' power are shared, which means you will actually gain more power by being willing to work with others. So the actual incentive is to work together rather than destroy your competition. So we will actually get a better type of politics under PR than we have now, where everybody's just out to destroy everyone.
I am being so tempted to open this tab on PR, but I'm gonna stop. I'm being baited, but I'm gonna stop because my whole master's was about voting systems, and so like I really am so interested in this, especially because when we had last two referendums ago, whenever it was, AV was the system that people were saying would do exactly what you're advocating. PR wasn't even in the discussion, to be quite frank, because folks were just like, the UK is just not ready for that. I'm a first past the post advocate, but you are right in that everything you've said would happen, will happen. The difficulty is just some people don't want that to happen, and so they're happy with the current system we have now, because alongside a change in system would have to be, like, I just think political education in this country is just poor. It's just so poor. So for me, any serious change has to be facilitated probably before by like really adequate training just for young people on these kind of issues, because it does worry me, and this is a slightly different point, and I'm aware that kind of we're out of time, but it does worry me the amount of people who on their Instagram bio would just be like Marxist, socialist, and I just go, hold on. Are you sure? It's like, yeah, burn the system down. I'm like, what's going on? And it's because they're watching YouTube videos with like superstars being like, I'm a Marxist, man, and you're like, hold, are you sure about this? So that for me is why I'm scared about changing systems when we don't have the kind of critical mass of young people who are educated, and not even just young people, I should just say just everybody in general. If we can do that and have them both together, same as lowering the voting age. I used to campaign for when I was a member of youth parliament, but my thing was, if we're going to make these big changes, it has to be right next to literally credible, solid political education in schools and even post for people who aren't there anymore. If we can get that, I'm on.
So a couple of things on the issue of being informed enough to vote. I did a tweet that went quite viral. It was basically a generation that voted to trash the economy based on a bus poster telling 16-year-olds they're not informed enough to vote. Is interesting. Like, we literally couldn't have done worse. Like, we have the worst pandemic death rate of any country in Europe and the worst economic recession of any OECD country. 16-year-olds literally couldn't have done worse. As for the issue of we need that political literacy, yes, absolutely. As for the issue of we need to have a better dialogue around politics to get there, absolutely. But just like with the issues around race, this country doesn't just need tinkering around the edges. We do need root and stem changes to actually achieve the things that we need to achieve. So yes, along with PR, along with making all votes count equally, which is what PR is about, you do need to also devolve powers to the regions to make sure you keep that local connection, have regional assemblies. We do need a written constitution so that we can avoid all the problems we've seen constitutionally over the last few years, like where a prime minister can just shut down parliament because it's doing the wrong things it doesn't like. We need those sorts of things in place. There are serious changes that need to happen in this country, but the way you get there is by making sure that every voice is heard. And because we have a majority of this country that does vote progressive, and because the left vote is split now, the only way to get there is by making all votes count equally, which is PR.
Yeah, no, I take your point. And like with racism, I guess the question that's kind of hanging over all of this is where the political appetite is in the country for these big and seismic changes. Opinion polls say one thing, but when people go to vote in the poll in the booth with things closed, we get different results. So it'll be interesting to see what happens on racism. My hope is, of course, that things get better. I think right now I've got to resolve that I just have to keep doing stuff in my private life, and the cultural stuff. Just don't call me. I'm not interested. I'm just gonna, honestly, because there's just no. Some people have the kind of the whatever the term is, that they're willing to do it, but it's just tiring now. And so fingers crossed. The UK will get better as per race relations. But Femi, I know you're one of those people. I'm gonna be living vicariously through your debates online. I think that's what's gonna be happening. I'm gonna be like, yes, because you guys do a great job. Honestly, I look at it, especially on this topic, because Of course, we're not agreeing on everything, but on this topic, you know, I honestly, I think you must know that you're speaking up for so many people. You know, I think about yourself. I think about Dr. Shola, who literally is like my auntie. I don't know her. You know, I think we spoke on the same event once, but I don't know her. But she's like my auntie, and I just sit down, and just like, yes. keep going. And I think I speak for thousands of people, and I just say, like, you know, you're doing a great job, and you just have to keep going. So yeah, thank you for all of that. When can we catch you next? Are you on any kind of shows permanently or anything like that? Or you know?
So I'm on Jeremy Vine semi-regularly. So the next one's on the 7th of April, and then another one on the 28th of April. So that's what I do, and then on top of that, I write for the Independent on a regular basis. So that's what you'll catch next.
Superb. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this. Take your rest, because it's tough in these streets.
Yeah, they're keeping it fun.